It's amazing when you really think about it, all the laws that are out there, all the regulations, especially when they're dealing with different types of properties and institutions here in India. It's really quite something.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly complex. And that actually leads us perfectly into what we're diving into today.
Mm.
This whole thing with the recent developments surrounding the Waqf Amendment bill, this is in 2024.
Right. And for anyone listening who's really into current events, or is fascinated by like the details of Indian law, this bill has been a big talking point.
Yeah, it's been hard to miss. And that interest that people have is what brings us here. It's a super important piece of legislation. It's all about managing and overseeing a really significant category of properties here in India.
We're talking Waqf properties. So for anyone who might not be familiar with that term, we're talking about properties that have been donated or dedicated specifically by Muslims for religious purposes, charitable purposes, or pious purposes.
Right, things like mosques, schools, graveyards, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And this bill, the Waqf Amendment Bill of 2024, it's all about updating the legal framework for how these properties are managed. We're going to break it all down for you. Its journey through Parliament, the core changes it proposes, and the amendments that have gotten the green light from the Union Cabinet. They're basing this on recommendations from a joint parliamentary committee, which, by the way, is a committee with members from both houses of Parliament.
Yeah, so this deep dive is really to help everybody listening get a solid grasp of what this bill is trying to achieve, the debates that have popped up around it, and ultimately what it could mean going forward for these Waqf properties and how they're run.
Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Let's start with the bill's origin story. It's not like it just appeared out of thin air.
Oh, definitely not. The Waqf Amendment Bill, the one from 2024, was actually introduced back in August 2023. And its main goal, the big one, is to amend the existing Waqf Act. That's from 1995. And that, as you mentioned, is the primary law that governs how Waqf's properties are managed all across India.
And if I'm remembering correctly, the initial push behind this bill, the driving force, had two main components to it. There was the idea of more government oversight over these properties and also a revamp of how disputes related to them are dealt with. Is that right?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. The government's stated goals were all about boosting accountability and making the whole process of dealing with conflicts or problems related to Waqf lands and institutions more streamlined, more efficient. But as is often the case with big legislative proposals, its path through Parliament wasn't exactly a walk in the park.
Yeah, it wasn't smooth sailing at all. I remember reading that this bill faced a pretty good amount of scrutiny, and that ultimately led to it being sent over to a joint parliamentary committee, or JPC for short.
Absolutely, and that's a really key step in the whole legislative process, especially when there are major concerns or a need to build more widespread agreement on something. Now, this particular JPC was led by BJP MP Jagadambika Pal, and let me tell you, they had their work cut out for them.
Oh, I bet. 58 proposed amendments. That's a huge number to sift through. So what happened? What was the outcome of all those discussions and deliberations?
Well, after going through everything very carefully, the JPC decided to accept 14 of the proposed amendments, and they recommended that the other 44 be tossed out. The really important thing here is that the Union Cabinet has given the thumbs up to all 14 of those accepted amendments.
So that means these are the changes that are essentially cleared at the executive level. Now, for those of us following along at home, what's the next step in this whole legislative journey?
Okay, so the bill, now with these approved amendments all stitched in, is on its way to Parliament. They're expecting to present it during the second half of the budget session. That kicks off on March 10th of next year, 2025. So yeah, this is something you'll probably be hearing more about in the coming months. Keep your ears peeled.
I definitely will.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got a good handle on the bill's backstory and where things are headed. But let's dig into the real meat of it. Let's talk about those key amendments that have gotten the nod. The first one that really stood out to me was about the whole registration of Waqf properties. Can you walk us through what the original rules were and how they've been tweaked?
Sure. Initially, the bill said, okay, all Waqf properties have to be registered on this brand new central portal. And they gave them a deadline, a pretty tight one, 6 months from when the law went live. But the JTC, they realized that this time frame might be a bit unrealistic for a lot of Waqf institutions, just given how many properties there are and how complex some of them can be.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, just thinking about all the work involved in documenting these properties properly, that's a tall order.
Oh, yeah, it's a big undertaking. So they decided to go with an amendment that gives a little wiggle room. It allows for an extension to that 6-month deadline. The catch is the mutawali, that's the caretaker or manager of the property, has to give a solid reason for needing the extra time.
So who makes the call on whether the reason they give is good enough to get that extension.
That decision goes to the Waqf Tribunal. They have the power to grant those extensions. Now, here's something to keep in mind, though. The amendment doesn't put a hard limit on how long those extensions can be. It seems like the tribunal has the flexibility to decide on a case-by-case basis.
So it's more flexible for the Waqf boards, but they still need to be responsible and explain any delays.
Exactly. That's the key takeaway. Now, what about those Waqf properties that haven't been registered for a much longer time, even before this new law was even a thought?
That's a great question. What happens to those properties?
The JPC thought about that too. They approved another amendment that specifically tackles that scenario. It gives those unregistered Waqfs more time to file legal proceedings, even if they missed that initial 6-month window to register on the portal. But there's a condition. They have to submit an affidavit explaining why they were late registering.
Okay, so it's not like a free pass. They still have to be accountable. Why is this extension for unregistered Waqfs such a big deal?
Well, it could be really crucial for properties that are stuck in legal battles. Imagine a walkable that hasn't officially registered. They might hit roadblocks when trying to fight for their legal claims. This amendment could open up a way for them to get their day in court as long as they can explain the delay. It's like a safety net for walk-offs who are trying to secure their rights to properties that have been in dispute for a long time.
That's a really important point for everyone to grasp. Let's shift gears now and talk about another big area where they've made changes: dispute resolution. Specifically, the role of government officials in this whole process. It seems like this part was really hotly debated when the bill was first introduced.
Oh, you're absolutely right. There was a lot of back and forth about that. See, the initial proposal in that 2024 bill was to change who gets to decide if the government has a claim to land that's also claimed as Waqf property. They wanted to take that power away from the Waqf Tribunal and hand it over to the district collector.
Wow, that's a pretty significant shift in authority, isn't it?
Yeah.
What were people saying about that? What were the concerns surrounding that original proposal?
A lot of people were worried about potential bias. Is a revenue official really the best person to decide on matters that are, at their heart, legal? And sometimes they touch on sensitive religious issues, too. The JPC heard those concerns loud and clear, and that's why they ended up tweaking this part of the bill.
So what's the new plan? Who's going to be in charge of deciding these government property claims that involve Waqf land now?
Instead of the district collector, they're bringing in a designated senior state government officer. That's their title. This person's job will be to make any needed changes to the revenue records. Those are the official government documents that show who owns what land. They'll step in if it's decided that a property belongs to the government and not a whacker.
So it's still a government official, but they're higher up the ladder. Does the amendment specify what kind of experience or qualifications this senior officer needs to have?
It says senior state government officer, but it doesn't get into the specifics of their exact expertise, at least not in the information we have. But the fact that they're moving away from the district collector does suggest they're trying to bring in someone with more experience, more knowledge of how things work in government.
There's a really important detail in all of this that I want to make sure everyone catches. It says that until a final decision is made about a disputed property, that property will be treated as government property. What does that mean in practice? What should our listeners be aware of when it comes to this interim status?
That's a sharp observation. You're right. That's super important. If they're treating a property as government property while they're still figuring things out, it could have a bunch of implications. For the Waqf institution, it might mean they can't access the property freely. It might mean they can't manage it the way they want to. And there's even the chance they could lose out on income that the property could be generating during this waiting period. It's not ideal. It could even weaken their position when they finally get to present their case in court.
It makes you wonder about fairness.
Yeah.
About whether the scales are balanced when these disputes pop up. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about what they're proposing for the Waqf boards themselves. Specifically, about who gets to be on them, the whole representation question. There was something about non-Muslim members and the chief executive officer. Can you remind me what that was all about?
Yeah, the first draft of the bill said they wanted to let a non-Muslim be the chief executive officer. And they wanted at least 2 non-Muslim members on each Waqf board at the state level. These members would be appointed by the state government. Now, the JPC did go for an amendment here, but their focus was more on what qualifications the government official on the board should have.
Got it. So what's the change when it comes to the government official who gets a seat on the Waqf board?
Okay, so the amendment says this government official has to be at least at the joint secretary level or a similar position in the state government. And here's the kicker. They have to be actively working on WAC issues.
That makes a lot of sense. They want someone with real experience in Waqf affairs so they can bring a more informed perspective to the board. What's the significance of specifically mentioning the joint secretary level?
The joint secretary level, that usually means someone with a decent amount of experience and seniority in the government. It tells you they want a government representative who has some real weight, someone knowledgeable, not some junior person who might not have the authority or experience to handle tricky administrative stuff.
Now, they also proposed a change to the Waqf Tribunal itself, right?
Yeah.
Something about the expertise of the people on it.
Yep, another really important amendment to keep in mind. The JPC said they want to make sure there's a member on the Waqf Tribunal who really knows their stuff when it comes to Muslim law and jurisprudence. They want an expert.
Why is that addition so important? Why do they need someone like that on the tribunal?
Think about it. The Waqf Act and the whole system of managing Waqf properties, it's all deeply rooted in Islamic law. Having someone there who understands the ins and outs of that, it could really shape how the tribunal makes its decisions. It means their judgments will be based on a solid understanding of the relevant legal and religious principles. This is a big step toward making sure that the rulings are in line with Islamic law, which could lead to decisions that are more informed from a religious standpoint.
Seems like a pretty valuable addition, especially when you think about the kinds of disputes that the tribunal have to deal with. So how does this impact the overall makeup of the Waqf Tribunal?
Before, the idea was to have a sitting or retired district judge as the chairperson, and then a joint secretary-level officer from the state government as a member. That was it. This new amendment, it adds a third person to the mix. And this new member has to be that expert in Muslim law we were talking about.
All right. So taking a step back and looking at the big picture, we've got adjustments to the registration timelines, changes in how disputes are resolved, and what role government officials play, and then these modifications to who sits on the Waqf boards and the tribunal. What's the point of all this? What are they hoping to achieve with these revisions?
It looks like the main goal is to find a better balance. They want to make sure there's enough government oversight to keep things running smoothly, to prevent misuse of Waqf properties, but they also want to respect the independence of these institutions and the specific legal and religious context that they operate under. It's a balancing act. All these amendments, they suggest a move towards a system that wants input from both the government and experts in religion and law.
So it sounds like they're trying to fix some of the problems that people had with the original bill, like that worry that the government would have too much power and the need for disputes to be settled fairly by people who really know what they're talking about.
Exactly. The registration amendments are about giving WACs more flexibility and more ways to seek legal action if they need to. The changes to the dispute resolution process, they're bringing in higher-ranking government officials, but they're still keeping the final say within a quasi-judicial system. And then the changes to who's on the Waqf board and the tribunal, those are about making the government more accountable and making sure there are people there who are experts in religious and legal matters.
And remember, this revised bill is headed to Parliament soon. So does that mean there's still a chance for things to change even more? Will there be more debates and discussions before this becomes law?
Oh, absolutely. This is just one step in the process. When it gets to Parliament, they'll examine it closely. There's always a chance that someone will propose new amendments and they'll debate them right there on the House floor. The Union Cabinet gave the thumbs up to these 14 amendments, and that's a big deal. But the final version of the Waqf Amendment Act, the 2024 one, well, that's still up in the air. It all depends on what happens in Parliament.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the Waqf Amendment Bill 2024. It's clearly a complicated piece of legislation, and it could have major implications for how these important religious and charitable properties are managed all over India.
You got that right. And for anyone out there who's really into Indian law, how the government works, and how religious institutions are run, understanding how this bill has made its way through the system, the changes they're trying to make, and the thinking behind those changes, well, that's all really important stuff. It's worth paying attention to.
Couldn't agree more. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've seen this push for more government control in these amendments, but at the same time, they're also stressing the need to get legal and religious experts involved in making decisions. So given those two things, what do you think will be the biggest pluses and the biggest challenges that come out of these amendments? What will it mean for Waqf properties and how they're managed? Keep that in mind as this whole thing plays out. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.